we're really excited to welcome all of you here, and part of our vision for, as Catherine said, for this Associate and Fellows lecture series was to have a chance to ensure that all of the incredible research and energy and work that's happening at the lab and with our fellows and associates will also be brought to bear on those of you in the community who are interested in doing this work here in Nova Scotia and around the world. So tonight it's my distinct pleasure to introduce one of our fellows to you, Daniel Del Gobbo. I know for many of you this won't be an introduction, but will be a chance to hear and see someone whose work you know and have used. And for others of you, this will be a treat because it'll be your first chance to hear Daniel and hear him talk about the really incredible research and work that he's doing. I will say, just before I tell you some official things about him, which are also posted in the bio that's on the slide. One of the things I love most about Daniel and his scholarship is he is unrelenting in asking critical questions, and is every bit the critical scholar, but is committed to asking those questions with the audacity to imagine that we can find some answers that might make the world better, rather than just asking them in order to be critical or to tear things down. He ardently believes there are some things that we need to question and destabilize, and but with the purpose of making them better. And that justice-centered commitment comes through in all of his work, from its most analytical and critical and scholarly to that which is including those in community and those whose lives he is fervently interested in helping to make better. And I have an incredible amount of respect and have learned an incredible amount from his research and his work, and importantly, how he does it. So lucky Windsor Law, Daniel is a newly minted and appointed assistant professor at Windsor Law. And so we'll have the opportunity to finish up the current Banting postdoctoral fellowship that he's doing at McGill University next year. And then we'll take up his post in Windsor. I'm not just a little bit jealous, I'm a lot jealous about that. But I think I'm convincing him that he'll stay deeply connected to the lab and to the Schulich School of Law through that, as he has as a fellow, and hopefully will move on to do so by staying associated. His research focuses on the possibilities of restorative justice and transformative justice in promoting equality for women, LGBTQ2 peoples, and other historically marginalized groups. He earned his SJD from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 2021. And while he was there, he was also a Trudeau Scholar, Shirk Doctoral Fellow, and held the CBA's Viscount Bennett Fellowship. He previously earned an LLM from Harvard in 2015, and his JD is from Osgoode Hall Law School in 2011. He's published widely in areas like civil procedure, human rights, access to justice, and critical theory, restorative justice, and feminist theory, and he manages to integrate all of those areas of interest and expertise as he brings them to bear on his work and thinking about how to address some of our most complex and intractable problems. And so today he's going to speak to us. I love this title. I love this title. His talk is entitled Lighting a Spark, Playing with Fire, Feminism, Emotions, and the Legal Imagination of Campus Sexual Violence. And so I'll turn things over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Jennifer. That was incredibly generous. Feminism, Emotion, and the Legal Imagination of Campus Sexual Violence. The presentation is based on my forthcoming article with the same title that will be published in the next issue of the Dalhousie Law Journal, as well as my forthcoming book, tentatively entitled Negotiating Feminism, Charting a Path Through Campus Sexual Violence Policy, which is under contract with the University of Toronto Press. So campus sexual violence has become the province of increased rulemaking, governance, and bureaucratic activity in the last 10 years. Feminist law and policymakers have campaigned for targeted reforms in this area, including the widespread adoption of campus sexual violence policies at colleges and universities across Canada and the United States. One of the byproducts of this strategy to incorporate feminist values into the state and into state-affiliated power of colleges and universities has been the creation of institutional arrangements that address campus sexual violence through formal legal methods. On their face, most policies reflect the preference that students report their experiences and make formal complaints in campus adjudication as their primary means of legal and political redress. Consistent with these trends, feminist critics have argued that forms of consensual dispute resolution, including restorative justice, can lead to unfair procedures and unjust results in campus sexual violence cases. And this view is widely supported across Canada and the United States, causing many colleges and universities to limit, or in some cases ban, the use of consensual dispute resolution in their policies altogether. Notably, the US Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights released an influential guidance in April 2011, known as the Dear Colleague Letter. It's there at the bottom right of your screen, which prohibited the use of mediation in campus sexual violence cases under Title IX, a US law that requires gender equity in federally funded education programs. So mediation was the only consensual process named in the guidance. However, most colleges and universities interpreted the guidance to prohibit the use of restorative justice in campus sexual violence cases as well. So in my remarks today, I provide a critical feminist perspective on the role of consensual dispute resolution in campus sexual violence policy. I'll argue that collectively generated experiences of emotion play a central role in shaping what counts as justice and injustice in campus sexual violence cases. Focusing on the events surrounding the Faculty of Dentistry at Dalhousie University in 2014 and 2015, I explain how emotional incitements in the case contributed to a political and discursive infrastructure that supported formal and in many cases punitive responses to campus sexual violence. Correspondingly, I explain why alternative modes of legal and political formation that challenge the premises of the formal law, including the restorative justice process employed in the case, was misread by some commentators as being a form of weak justice and therefore outside the bounds of feminist action. My claim is not that particular emotional reactions to campus sexual violence are right or wrong, but that feminist law and policymakers should critically reflect on and assess their political force. So I'll structure my remarks as follows. First, I'll begin by recounting the facts of the Dalhousie Dentistry case, explaining the male student's conduct in the case and the restorative justice process that followed. And I realize that some audience members may be familiar with the case already. We're very fortunate to have Jennifer in the audience. She was one of the co-facilitators of the restorative justice process in the case. I recount the facts here because it's important to understand the issues and to recognize the gravity of the harms that students experienced. But please take care when listening to this part because the case involves sexual harassment and assault. Second, I'll reflect on my own emotional reactions to the case as a feminist and LGBTQ student activist, what I remember thinking and feeling about the events at the time. And cognizant of the limits of my social location and positionality in the feminist movement as a white gay man, I can attest that emotions play an important role in raising the public's awareness, building solidarity among complainants and allies, and inspiring feminist law and policymakers to take moral action on campus sexual violence. Third, I'll consider the links between emotions and carcerality as one possible form of moral action in this context. I explain that emotions can be leveraged in support of carceral state responses to campus sexual violence by rationalizing them as legitimate. Correspondingly, I explain that emotions can be leveraged against legal theories and methodologies that challenge the carceral state, including restorative justice, by rationalizing them as a form of weak justice and insufficiently tough on crime. Fourth and finally, I'll provide my key takeaways from this analysis. Critically reflecting on the ways that emotions are mobilized, I suggest, reveals the benefits and drawbacks of engaging with the law in ways that feel emotionally gratifying and therefore legally and politically necessary, but which can lead to carceral state responses that contradict the mission of substantive equality. As such, one of the purposes of my talk is to recalibrate feminism's relationship with restorative justice. It's an internal critique of formalist and legalistic trends in feminism from within feminism itself. So on December 6, 2014, a fourth-year male student in the Faculty of Dentistry at Dalhousie posted a question about his female classmates in an all-male private Facebook group of students. The question took the form of an online poll asking, "Who would you hate fuck?" and provided names to vote on. Shortly thereafter, screenshots of the poll and other offensive misogynistic posts were leaked to the CBC News, where the story exploded in the Canadian media and the full scope of the male students' conduct came to light. Most troublingly, several of the men talked about committing sexual assault while their patients were sedated with chloroform. Most of the female students involved chose to proceed with their complaints through a restorative justice process on campus. The process ran for 5 months, with each of the male students spending over 150 hours in restorative justice. The process was conducted under constant threat of being terminated. Students rallied at the university to raise public awareness and condemn the male students' conduct, holding signs that read such things as "expel misogyny," "we want names," and "expel rape culture." An online petition that the university should punish the male students garnered over 50,000 signatures. Op-eds and think pieces were published nationwide that weighed the relative merits and drawbacks of the university's response. The Halifax Regional Police became involved in response to requests for a criminal investigation, pleading for the female students to come forward and make formal reports. So I remember what I felt when I heard about the Facebook group for the first time. I was an LLM student at Harvard Law School in 2014-2015 year, a place steeped at the time in public intellectual debates surrounding campus sexual violence and the enforcement of Title IX, in the wake of the popular documentary The Hunting Ground, which focused on Harvard. It was a combination of emotions, insecurity, frustration, hopelessness, and increasingly sheer rage, feelings that I shared with feminist colleagues who expressed the same feelings to me. And I recall vividly the impression of the events encircling around me, creating this sense of connection and means of engagement with colleagues who experience the same thing, which then reinforced the legitimacy of my emotions and compounded their effects. So most immediately, the revelation reminded me about the urgency of my feminist mandate. It revealed campus sexual violence to be a cause and effect of substantive inequality between women and men. And there could be no denying the nature or gravity of the issue any longer. I thought about the effect of the poll on the female students at Dalhousie, some of whom reported feeling unsafe around the men after the story broke. The fact of the women's harm, considered in light of the men's status as privileged wrongdoers holding on to privileged positions at an elite professional school, made me angry. So enlightening people about the nature and the severity of campus sexual violence is a necessary first step toward addressing the problem. Emotions play an important role in this recognition function, signaling to the public that women, LGBT peoples, and other historically marginalized groups recognize the harms being done to them. Among other things, my emotional reactions to the Facebook group conveyed the fact that Canadians are living in a rape culture. So rape culture is a highly politicized and not always legal category, including grounds for sanction that often would have little traction off campus. If you consider that campus sexual violence has been defined by colleges and universities to include everything from crude jokes about sex to flirting aggressively, catcalling, flashing, gender stereotyping, image-based sexual abuse, rape chants, sexual harassment, stealth condom removal, and sexual assault. Commenting on this phenomenon, Joseph Fischel criticizes parts of Title IX enforcement and the Me Too movement for, quote, lumping together and flattening more and less serious types of campus sexual violence without making clear the legal distinctions between them. So I suggest that eliciting affect is one of the primary purposes of such lumping rhetoric. Generally speaking, the more emotionally affecting the problem is, the more visible it becomes and the more pressing the need to address it feels. So consider the title of The Hunting Ground, right, which suggests that sexual predators have declared open season on hunting women and girls on campus. The figure of the rape victim is compelling to many of us because of the emotions it evokes, right? Fear, shock, anger, and the moral indignation that surrounds the cause of protecting them. Colleges and universities have similarly adopted a rape crisis framing of campus sexual violence, with many schools partnering with rape crisis centers in the United States to address a problem that is presumed to be as widespread and devastating as the term crisis suggests. Framings of campus sexual violence as an epidemic, emergency, and a scourge have operated in the same way. The exceptionalism of rape culture resonates less with the feeling that campus sexual violence is new and unusual, I suggest, but that campus sexual violence is a moral issue and evidence of a social disorder that is potentially incurable. So I can personally attest to some of the ways that feminist student activism has relied on the circulation of affect in the service of campus sexual violence reform. My emotional responses to the Facebook group helped to organize my experiences, connecting me with feminist colleagues who were similarly affected by the structures of inequality that we felt and therefore knew to exist. Emotions bore witness to the truth and the authenticity of our subject positions within a broader social movement. And collectively, our emotions leveled a clear and powerful indictment of the colleges and universities that failed to address campus sexual violence, a story that was not being heard or acknowledged to our emotional satisfaction. As such, emotions fed into the means of our feminist resistance and critique of the institutions that made us feel insecure, frustrated, hopeless, and angry in the first place. Emotions were instrumental to the process of our mobilization because they provided the motivation to both struggle and express our legal grievances to the world. So my interest in the relationship between law, gender inequality is inspired by longstanding concerns about feminism's complicity with the carceral state. Previously, I explained that the restorative justice process in the Dalhousie Dentistry case was conducted under constant threat of being terminated. Feminist critics were extremely vocal at the time, with many of their objections expressing the view that restorative justice was too soft on crime and failed to take sexual abuse seriously. And I remember feeling something similar upon hearing about the process for the first time, not knowing much about it. It felt like the male students were getting a mere slap on the wrist, like colleges and universities had found yet another way to sweep the problem under the rug. The breadth and the severity of the male students' conduct made me angry, as I said, but the prospect of the men finding an easy way out and the university escaping a more public and searching review of its academic climate and culture made me angrier still. So feminist debates about campus sexual violence reform have been characterized by a particular feminist orthodoxy about what taking sexual abuse seriously requires. Amanda Neeland reviewed the content of campus sexual violence policies at 43 colleges, universities, Canadian colleges and universities in 2016 and 2017, one of the most comprehensive Canadian studies of its kind. So generally speaking, complainants can choose how their reports will be processed, but choices are often limited to whether complaints will trigger a criminal process, campus adjudication, or no response at all. Most policies encourage complainants to report their experiences to campus security. Some policies provide that complainants have participatory rights in campus adjudication, but complainant involvement in the process is relatively limited. Complainants are free to stop engaging with the process at any time, but most policies establish the school's right to proceed with an investigation or hearing without their consent. Correspondingly, few of the policies create opportunities for the parties to engage in restorative dialogue or community-based norm clarification around campus sexual violence. Provisions on consensual dispute resolution where they exist are either brief and unelaborated or significantly limited in their availability to students. And there are parallels to the criminal law here, I suggest, specifically the police or prosecutor's sole right, depending on the province to proceed with laying charges. And like in a criminal proceeding, there's little opportunity for complainants to tell their story in their own words, let alone retain any decisional power over the consequences that the parties should face. So most colleges and universities have revised their policies since Neeland's study was conducted, but her findings remain generally accurate. In a forthcoming book chapter, Diane Crocker and Gina Dufour review these developments and conclude that as of 2021, quote, campus sexual violence policies have replicated the disadvantages of criminal justice responses to gender-based violence and have not adopted the advantages of more restorative justice approaches, quote. So I would argue that the structure of campus sexual violence policies reflects the influence of what Donna Coker calls crime logic in the Title IX context, or a set of beliefs and attitudes about the role of the carceral state in regulating and punishing campus sexual violence. The term captures feminism's complicity in a reactionary politics of crime control, blurring social justice and criminal justice, punishing in the name of gender equality. So crime logic is predicated on the commission of reciprocal acts of carceral state violence against individual bad apples. In many cases, it functions like a neoliberal publicity stunt. Colleges and universities cleanse themselves of financial and reputational risk by exacting swift and harsh punishments on targeted individuals, returning the community to its previously safe condition, while in fact, the systemic problem is left unaddressed. So I suggest that critical theories of law and the emotions help to explain the prevalence of these trends. Arguably, crime logic is evidence of a phenomenon that Jonathan Simon calls governing through crime, whereby crime and the forms of knowledge historically associated with it become powerful tools with which to interpret and frame social issues. Colleges and universities have engendered a culture of fear, I suggest, by promulgating legal regulations to combat the ostensible pervasiveness of crime. Fear operates by making the audience believe that crime is imminent and threatening. The production of fear has been so effective and widespread that it's become directed at individuals who are neither current nor prospective criminals, strengthening the carceral state in the process. Fischel's critique of lumping rhetoric and similarly evocative sensationalist language reveals the effects of power and discourse that such representations of campus crime and rape culture produce. Postulating in a similar vein, Wendy Brown suggests that when colleges and universities make emotionally charged appeals to women's fearful, traumatized subjectivity by campus sexual violence or otherwise, they run the risk of performing and circulating feelings of victimhood in reality. So Brown explains that criminal justice contains an incitement to what Nietzsche calls ressentiment, or the moralizing revenge of the powerless. Rather than transforming victimhood into something else, the creative process of ressentiment externalizes the condition by legitimizing the state's role and punishing the individuals responsible for causing it. So crime logic is a complex legal and political operation, and I cannot trace its origins in a comprehensive way in this talk, but it strikes me that emotions must be partially responsible for constructing its rational claims and lending them moral force. Contemporary psychological and philosophical accounts teach us that emotions are essential to the proper functioning of rationality and therefore lead to moral actions. And there are almost certainly other mechanisms at play in this operation, but Simon and Brown provide compelling accounts, I suggest, of the role of fear, anger, and vengeance in rationalizing carceral norms and logics. Many community members feel that by exacting legal punishments and other forms of discipline, something meaningful has been done about campus sexual violence. Correspondingly, I would argue that central to understanding the role of emotions in legitimizing the carceral state is recognizing a corollary claim about the role of emotions in fostering skepticism of theories and methodologies that challenge the carceral state. So Jennifer Llewellyn suggests that in the Dalhousie Dentistry case, quote, the certainty offered by formal systems resulted in considerable disappointment, occasionally rising to the level of outrage that restorative justice had denied what was owed according to the existing formal processes, end quote. The certainty of punishment was so ingrained in the case, Jennifer suggests, that it affected an epistemic occupation with criminal justice, causing some feminists to experience, quote, profound difficulty imagining and conceptualizing the redress and prevention of violence without recourse to the state. Arguably, I suggest the process is similar to what Max Delmar calls the affective dimension of imaginative resistance, citing the challenges that arise when a subject is asked to imagine a particular situation, but is either unwilling or unable to do so. Recall that feminist student activists lined the streets to publicly condemn the male students' conduct in the case, holding signs that read "expel misogyny" and "expel rape culture." The political resonance of these framings is inextricably bound up in collectively generated experiences of good victimhood and bad victimhood, emphasizing the vulnerability of good victims in particular, most often white, heterosexual, cisgender, and class privileged women who are presumed to be fearful and traumatized and therefore most in need of the state's protection. Consistent with this view, feminist critics of the restorative justice process petitioned the university to conduct a more punitive process than restorative justice on a parallel track. Jennifer comments again on the influence of more established justice narratives. Quote, "The public demanded that the university play its traditional part in the justice story. They were to find the monsters and punish them, ideally by isolating them from the rest of us, by expelling them to make them pay, and somehow making us all richer for their loss," end quote. So a comprehensive review of procedural fairness and equity considerations in the case is beyond the scope of this talk. However, Jennifer's observations about what punishment is supposed to make us feel resonate with me because they help to explain, my own initial objections to the restorative justice process. The circulation of affect contributed to a feminist climate in which loud public calls to punish the male students, to literally expel misogyny personified with or without a fair hearing, was genuinely felt by some feminists, myself included, like it was a legal and political necessity and emotional salve for the community's harms. Correspondingly, restorative justice felt like it was a morally inadequate response to campus crime because it failed to produce a single culprit, a single monstrous other to isolate and condemn, and thus failed to assuage my emotions in a manner consistent with crime logic. As such, emotions provided one of the rhetorical and epistemological bases on which restorative justice was conceived as a form of weak justice, insufficiently tough on crime, and therefore outside the bounds of feminist action. In the next and final section, I'll provide my key takeaways from this analysis, shifting the focus from reflection to praxis, evaluating thoughts, feelings, and moral action together to gain perspective on feminist method and inform our legal and political practices for the better. On the level of action, how can feminist law and policymakers cultivate our rage and other emotions about campus sexual violence into a more critical and effective stance while resisting the lure of carceral norms and logics that feel like they are feminist? So central to asking the praxis question, to asking what can and what should be done, is reminding ourselves of what should not be done. In my view, feminist law and policymakers should not be told to feel less or feel differently about the immorality of campus sexual violence. Amia Srinivasan calls attention to cases of affective injustice in which women are forced to moderate their emotions, particularly anger, so as to appear reasonable and credible in light of the feeling rules of law and society, including in circumstances where anger would be a perfectly fitting response to their experiences. The containment and suppression of feminist rage to meet the feeling rules of the political majority is a racist and sexist form of emotional labor. As Brittany Cooper explains, the prevalence of the Black rage and angry Black woman tropes position racialized women as always already angry in order to render their anger unreasonable, preventing its externalization and containing its embodiment. Therefore, again, it's important to emphasize that emotions themselves are not right or wrong, feminist or not feminist. However, I suggest that emotions can be mobilized in support of carceral state practices and other moral actions that contradict the mission of substantive equality. And none of this is inevitable. Commenting on how feelings of anger are culturally produced and mediated, Judith Butler encourages feminists to craft our emotions for the better, not to meet racialized or gender expectations or other ritualized terms of public life, but to expose violence and counter it without causing harm in the process. Carceral feminism and its law are not fixed, but effects of power and discourse that can and must be changed. And I suggest that crafting our emotions as part of a radical critique of the carceral state is one way to do that. Such a crafting process requires feminists to transform our emotions into a more engaged legal and political stance, Sarah Ahmed suggests, to make connections between the object of one's anger and broader patterns or structures. In my view, feminist law and policymakers should critically reflect on how evocative, sensationalist representations of rape culture operate. Not to challenge their truth value necessarily, but to consider and evaluate their real-world consequences. Rhetorical framings of colleges and universities as being in a state of crisis or emergency suggest an imminency to the problem that lends itself to carceral state solutions, including mandatory reporting policies and increased police presence, which have proven to be ineffective at addressing campus sexual violence. On this point, Aya Gruber charts the progress of the so-called feminist war on crime, showing how claims of campus sexual violence may be overdetermined and overdrawn, often motivated by fear, homophobia, racial animus, and other cultural biases about gender and sexuality. As a result, feminist campaigns against campus sexual violence, particularly in the Title IX context, have lent themselves to criminal prohibitions that target members of historically marginalized groups, including Black, Indigenous, and other racialized men, low-income people, and LGBTQ peoples for punishment and mass incarceration. Positioning the carceral state, I suggest, as protective rather than oppressive of equality interests is a function of white supremacy, settler colonialism, heterosexism, and transphobia. Feminism should actively resist these forces. The paradigm image of the fearful, traumatized victim reinforces this connection between crime logic and campus sexual violence reform. On the one hand, elevating trauma as a marker of sexual harm has raised the public's awareness about the importance of trauma-informed lawyering in campus sexual violence cases. Feelings of terror and helplessness and despair can affect complainants' ability to interpret events in the past, manage the stress of the legal process, and respond in ways that members of the legal system expect. Recognizing this, feminists have advocated for the importance of trauma-informed approaches to professional service delivery. Considerable research has been done on how to improve criminal reporting procedures, interviews, and cross-examination techniques in order to better protect complainants' health and well-being. I suggest that legislative changes to facilitate more trauma-informed approaches are needed. On the other hand, Lauren Berlant cautions that emotional, and specifically fearful, traumatized subjectivity has become an essential index of value for personhood and thus for society. The clearest example is the Me Too movement, in which a combination of social and cultural pressure effectively compelled some complainants to take up voice and produce emotional testimony. The self-evidence and objectivity of their painful experiences thus legitimize claims to increase punishments in their names. Such moral actions, Berlant suggests, feel like justice because they help to eradicate complainants' pain. Feeling justice comes to mean the same thing as feeling better. Berlant never makes this point explicitly, but one of the consequences of this regime is that it becomes hard to talk about the so-called minor injuries that people experience, right? The more banal and quotidian, but no less significant harms that people endure because they're read as less painful and exceptional, and therefore less worthy of being heard. A related concern is that certain representations of fear and trauma, specifically white women's stories, are more legible to the masses and tend to invoke stronger emotional reactions in members of the public than others. Feeling someone else's pain is not necessarily an accurate marker. It's not necessarily coextensive with the extent of pain and suffering that is happening on a wider scale. So critics have referred to this phenomenon as emotional selectivity, which suggests that our emotions may not be comprehensive indicators of equality and justice in some cases. The paradigm image of the fearful, traumatized victims arguably elides important distinctions in the modalities of victimization that complainants experience, while further isolating complainants and racialized women in particular, who cannot or choose not to express their emotions in a socially acceptable manner, inspiring less compassion and empathy as a result. Research on rape myths and stereotypes confirms that complainants who do not look or act like good victims are less likely to be believed, have their reports taken seriously, and receive the community services they need to recover. This feeling gap in legal imagination, as I call it, is a serious problem. So to help bridge this gap, feminist law and policymakers should center the lived experiences of racialized, Indigenous, and bisexual women and trans people in campus sexual violence law and policy, because empirical evidence confirms that they are the most likely targets of campus sexual violence. Centering the experiences of these groups should lead feminists and other stakeholders to become more emotionally invested in their welfare. fostering compassion and empathy and other pro-social emotions toward intersectional communities is relevant to enabling one's capacity for what Max Del Mar calls multi-perspectival legal imagination, the practice of imagining the needs, the interests, and the values of another person as they are refracted in the concrete and particular experiences of persons and their relations with the world and others. Considering a variety of such perspectives is likely to improve feminist law and policymakers making by constructing a more complete picture of the relationships at stake, and thereby expand the possibilities for creating right relations for the future that are marked by care, concern, and respect for other people, consistent with the principle of substantive equality. Challenging the law's violence requires us to recognize that our fates are interconnected and everyone's lives, without exception, are both the subjects of feeling and the proper objects of feminist attention. So I focused on crime logic in this talk as one emotional politics that contradicts feminist goals, but there are many others that feminist researchers and others should examine and criticize as well, providing the basis for future work. I'm particularly struck by the fearful rhetoric and the strategic conservative outrage of trans-exclusionary radical feminists that is focused on oppressing trans women and gender non-conforming people through the passage of so-called bathroom bills, don't say gay policies, and other restrictive interpretations of human rights law, both in Canada and elsewhere. One could similarly focus on the feelings of shame, disgust, and antipathy that some prohibitionist women's groups have mobilized towards sex workers in the process of advocating for the Nordic model of prostitution law reform. In each of these contexts, emotional investments being made in feminism's name have had the effect of regulating gender and sexuality, but without challenging the power structures of heteronormativity and transphobia that bear down on historically marginalized groups in harmful ways. So if emotions are central to the process of feminist mobilization, then it should be incumbent on feminist law and policymakers to consider the force of our emotions from a substantive equality perspective. Critically reflecting on the progress of campus sexual violence reform helps us to see that. So I think that I'll stop there. I've talked too much, but thank you so much, Jennifer and Catherine again, and everyone in the audience for your time and attention. And everyone else at the Restorative Lab for this opportunity to present my work. And I look forward to the conversation, any questions that people might have.
Wonderful, thanks so much. So we can see one another. You're welcome to turn back on your camera if you're in a space where that makes sense for you. I'm able to ask you a few questions that have been percolating for folks while everybody takes the opportunity to gather their thoughts. You've been so generous, Daniel, in the way in which you kind of fused your own emotions and how you reacted to the case study and the case example. I'm sure that that was true for at least some of the people on the call, and continues, interestingly, to be true in the ways in which Dal Dentistry certainly lives for those in Nova Scotia when it is raised in the context of restorative justice or campus violence. But I suspect that you would welcome sort of people's reflections on their own kind of experiences of that or emotions of that, or questions that are asking you to elaborate or explain or further the discussion on a particular part of the talk. So I'll sort of with that open the floor to say I think we're looking forward to this being a space for some conversation and reflection. And so you don't have to come with a probing question, but you could come with a reflection in terms of how this has landed for you or how your experience was of these emotions. I want to start off by asking you one of the questions that's been posed about the comment you made about the importance of thinking about the implications of this role of emotions on the feminist project and feminist ambitions around the importance of crafting emotions and thinking about how we might do that. And so here there does seem to be some parallel about some of the work that restorative processes seek to do by creating sort of that space in which we can fuse people's experiences, understanding others' perspectives, but also through that, doing some of this work of crafting emotions. And so, so I wonder if you have any reflections, Daniel, to start us off on what you, in terms of your thinking about the prospects or potential of a restorative approach or these kinds of processes, what kind of space we need, what kind of place we need, what contribution might be made around that kind of opportunity to help craft those emotions, do that work of crafting emotions for our political ends in more strategic ways.
Absolutely. It's a great question. Thank you for that, Jennifer, and for that invitation to members of the audience. I'd just like to echo and reinforce what Jennifer said so eloquently. It's a challenging question because it's necessarily, I think, a context-specific matter about what crafting one's emotions and, you know, connecting what one feels to broader patterns and structures, to use Sarah Ahmed's words. What that actually looks like will depend on, you know, the social, cultural, and legal institutional context in which one is operating. I think that the restorative justice process at Dal and the restorative justice process what was employed provides us some indication of what is possible. You know, that's a legal process that relies on certain tools and strategies in order to help provide an opportunity for complainants and respondents and community members to express their emotions openly, to tell their stories in their own words, and then to critically reflect on what was said and to how you know, those stories made members of the public feel, and then to sort of think about concrete action items that the parties can then use, you know, once they you know, come together and really seek to listen to one another. There are sort of, you know, concrete tools that can help members in those kinds of processes to sort of channel or cultivate their emotions in a manner that is targeted toward broader patterns and structures, as we said. So I think that provides a helpful indication. It's very hard to speak in the abstract about these kinds of things, though. Yeah.
So as I spent my time during your talk trying to control my own emotions about my experience with Dal Dentistry, which continues to live, I did wonder, I just wanted to invite you to say a little bit about not only the impact that you've talked about in terms of how certain emotions might line up with crime logic and carceral kinds of responses, but also in a related way, what your thoughts are about how they might foreclose space for people to pursue other kinds of processes. So certainly our experience around, as reflected in the report, as both facilitators feeling we needed to protect that space and to try to have that space in place for sorting out how people are feeling, or for not creating space where they could not be reactive to the emotions outside. And I just wonder if you'd given any thought to that in terms of the role that emotions play in that foreclosing of the opportunities of others to process or experience their emotions or justice work differently. And then I'll go to Lisa.
Mm-hmm. It's really challenging. Something that I'll just sort of say generally is that when talking about the role of emotions in rationalizing moral action, right, which I'm talking about, the links between emotions and action are necessarily contingent and non-linear. You know, so I talked about fear and anger and vengeance, for instance, but, you know, feelings of anger may or may not produce a sight of revenge, if we look at Wendy Brown's theory, which may or may not lead to retribution, which may or may not entail the use of carceral state practices, as I've described them. But I think the possibility for this kind of progression exists, and that we saw it play out among certain groups and certain people with respect to the Dalhousie Dentistry case. I think in my own experience, it did, in my own feelings, but what I thought justice meant and what it meant to take sexual abuse seriously. I also think it's important to say that concerns about instrumentalization, really what I'm talking about here, are not unique to feminism or carceral feminism as such. So this isn't a problem that's unique to carceral feminism. Really, emotions provide, I suggest, one of the sort of rhetorical and epistemological bases for the constitutive institutional violence of the law to occur writ large. But this is a potentially radical claim because, there's this dichotomy in liberal legal theory between reason and law as sort of a manifestation of reason and emotion. Law is presumed to be free from many of these kinds of qualities. It's presumed to operate objectively. It's presumed to operate rationally, which is then understood to foreclose the role of emotions, when really scientists of emotion will tell you very clearly the role that emotions play in rationality. And that's obviously a gendered operation, right? So, historically, this kind of thing has been cited as a reason to exclude women from the sphere of law because they were presumed to be emotional and not rational. I mean, that's sort of the faraway historical context. And I realize now that I've gotten away from your question, but I just think it's important to think about. You got me off on a tangent about this, but it's just sort of important to thinking about the ways that emotion works to potentially foreclose one's imagination about thinking about what justice means. It's not that it's a clear or obvious or necessary connection, that if one feels this, therefore one will support something that is therefore bad. It's really rather just that sometimes our emotions can lead us to perceive something. It can both expand and limit our legal imaginations. It's both crucial, as I hope to convey, and sometimes it can lead us to think of things as being necessary or natural because they are an emotional salve for the harms that we experience. But what's more important, I think, is to assess the consequences of those actions taken in response to our emotions.
Really helpful. Thanks, Daniel. Lisa, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I'll just give a, so I work for one of the RJ agencies, and I would have been a caseworker back when the Dell Dentistry RJ process was going on. And it was such, I think, a crushing time for those of us who worked in the agencies. And I know some of my colleagues are here. I can't speak for them, but the media was so negative. And there was Christmas break was in there. And I just remember we were headed off on Christmas break, and the media was just so against any type of a restorative process. And family members and people I knew who knew what I did and who kind of got it would all of a sudden be saying, I don't think this is it. And I'd be saying, you don't get what I do you? And it was really hard to live through, because most of us who work in RJ or who like the approach live that to a degree. It's more of the way we are than a process that we use. But I was really struck by, not per se a question, but really struck by the idea that if you bring intersectionality into the mix, and it's bad enough if I'm a white female heterosexual and I have to deal with sexual assault or harassment, and I have to go in front of the courts, and heaven forbid I was drinking or I was wearing a short skirt that night. Even worse if I'm female, racialized, lesbian, and it really just, it sparked the ideas of both of access to education and access to justice, and how poorly that can be done in the courtroom. I don't know if you have any, this is a history, right? There's such a history around sexual assault and where it belongs. Does it belong in a courtroom? No, the courtroom's not doing the best job. So what else can we do? And any ideas about what an ideal approach to a sexual assault or a serious sexual harassment would look like?
Great questions. I'll address just sort of your first point, which I think is important to convey about the sort of media reactions to the restorative justice process at Dal, and others in this session can talk about them more accurately than I can, but I touched on them, that there really was a media frenzy around this case. And I think that the false perception, which was captured in a couple articles that I sort of included the headlines to in one of my slides by Ann Kingston and Isabel Cote, was that the process was a form of weak justice. When you read the report of the facilitators in the restorative justice process, it's a very long report. It's very clear how long and rigorous this process employed, how long it really was. I did say that the participants spent over 150 hours in restorative justice. It lasted 5 months. It culminated in a day of learning event in May, in which over 80 community stakeholders participated in the process and shared their learnings. So it really was a different kind of approach on a very fundamental level, which then raises challenging questions about how we sort of take these ideas and how we scale them or how we apply them in different contexts. I think that colleges and universities are a really important site of learning and innovation. I think that they're sort of laboratories of creativity anyway. The educational mandate of schools, I think, is consistent with the educational and transformative goals of restorative justice. So they're an important location where I think we can pilot more of these programs for different kinds of offenses, academic offenses. And we've seen that there's a huge literature on the potential of restorative justice in school settings, right? To address, particularly in the K-12 context, to address issues of violence and vandalism and cheating and those kinds of disciplinary issues at the high school level. So I think that once sort of, these precedents do exist, there are a few programs in which restorative justice processes have been applied in a sexual violence context. The evidence base is still being built. I suggest that there is enough evidence to roll out some of these pilot projects on a more fundamental level so that restorative justice is no longer simply an annex or an add-on to the criminal justice system that's applied at the post-sentencing or post-conviction stage, but ultimately at an earlier stage, and that parties can sort of choose to opt into this process and that there's significant financial institutional backing for that. Another objection that I often get when I talk about restorative justice from people who work in the criminal justice system or at colleges and universities is that what you're describing sounds great. We would love to do it, but we're under-resourced and we're under-trained. And there are real challenges to implement this kind of restorative vision that you have. And I think those are all fair points. So I think that, creating a program, it needs to be accompanied with real institutional buy-in, with resources to back it up and training. And it's a big conversation about what it might look like to really fundamentally change some of these cultural norms and expectations that we have around what taking sexual abuse seriously looks like, right? To really sort of challenge the sort of preeminence of criminal justice and crime logic, which is currently sort of many people's sort of guiding view about what it means to have an appropriate justice response in sexual violence cases and beyond. Just one really brief point to address your important concerns and comments about intersectionality, which I think are key here. I talked about centering the lived experiences of racialized and Indigenous and bisexual and trans people in particular, because those are the people who represent the most likely targets of campus sexual violence. Those groups may change slightly depending on the issue at stake, but generally it is historically marginalized groups whose perspectives should be centered. And this isn't my idea. This is really a fundamental principle of intersectional feminist methodology that if you look at Kimberly Crenshaw's articles in the 90s and the late 80s that really founded intersectionality, that's what she talked about, centering the experiences of Black women in policies around sexual violence in the United States. It's really that fundamental insight that we need to sort of take a contextual approach, which is also something that I value about restorative justice and why I think there are real linkages and the potential of restorative justice and transformative justice to take this kind of intersectional approach is that it's really focused on helping to sort of take complainants' concerns into account and then hopefully sort of channel them and cultivate them into a process that furthers the relational feminist, intersectional feminist goals of fostering right relations for the future. So great points, thank you.
Great. I should acknowledge for those of you, I've gotten now several sort of texts from folks saying that they're experiencing unusual levels of internet instability. So I think that might be a Nova Scotia thing, but now several people have gotten kicked off and have said after trying to rejoin several times, they are now going to watch the video. But just for those of you who are now watching the video, we miss you. And just to let you know, if you see people popping off or a couple of people have indicated that's why they have their camera off, that's what folks are trying to manage because they'd rather hear your words than have you just see their faces. So we will continue at this stage in the pandemic to convince the tech gods that we deserve to be able to gather together and have free-flowing conversation without them interrupting with static or whatever else. But we will march on. Jacob, you had a question you indicated to me in the chat, so maybe I'll turn it over and let you come on the camera and ask it.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So Daniel, I was just struck by a couple of things while you were speaking there. The one thing that occurs to me is like this idea of this prioritization of this sort of like the really bad most easily sort of instrumentalized emotion around. So like the more violent kind of I'm sorry. Were you saying
I was just double checking if you froze for Daniel or not, because you froze for me.
Oh no, I can hear. I'm great. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm just wondering. I mean, I'm thinking about the way in which if there's all this sort of emotional rhetoric and baggage sort of tied to the more these sort of like, let's say, severe cases, so to speak, right, of sexual violence, then the sort of more insidious, or I think you said banal harms get swallowed up in the sort of it's not as easy, I guess, just to put it frankly, like to build emotion around those kind of insidious harms. So it was just, this is more of just a comment, just a revelatory moment for me from the talk, because of I'm sort of been thinking about those kinds of sort of the more insidious harms that lately, and thinking about that in the context of sport, but the way in which you can't bring emotion around behind that makes it very tricky to think about. So I don't know if you want to respond to that or anything, if you have any sort of more thoughts on that idea.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's something that also was a revelation for me in reading a lot of affect theory in helping to write this paper. The critical theories of the humanities, I find they're often so ahead of legal theory in so many ways, but a lot of it is focused not simply on sort of the most exceptional cases of sexual violence or other forms of crime, which are most obviously affecting to us, but they really try to drill down on the banal and the quotidian, the small aggressions, the small violences that people experience, but which may not be as easily translatable in legal terms, or which people might struggle to express in the same way that they might express, sort of moral indignation around protecting a victim of sexual violence, for instance. So I think that's really fascinating to think about how the law can address these kinds of banal quotidian aggressions. Some of them may actually translate to crimes or to civil causes of action, but they don't affect us in the same way. And I know that you're researching the potential of restorative justice in sport contexts, and that's, again, very interesting. That is a particular environment where I think certain kinds of emotional expression are probably fostered and encouraged more than others, right? I don't know what kinds of sports you're looking at, but let's say it's a male-dominated environment. Again, there's a particular gendered aspect to that environment, I would think, in which men probably feel like they can express a particular kind of emotional reaction to their teammates, when really they might be experiencing other kinds of grievances or harms, but it's very challenging for them to express that sort of banal quotidian harm. How we sort of get at that, how we unearth that and try to sort of assuage those feelings is, I think, really tricky to think about.
And even just the nature of the feelings that, when you talk to people who have experienced those kinds of quotidian harms, the feelings that it evokes for them often aren't the kind of, like, they're weird kind of gray feelings themselves. They're not feelings that you can write Globe and Mail articles about. Like, it just made me feel weird is not an article. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so I mean, the reality of emotions and the way that you can mobilize around emotions that's fascinating. Thank you very much.
So I can't help but sort of think about the sort of Hannah Arendt insight around the banality of evil, when it is often so systemic and ingrained and cultural, with sort of some of these comments about where we might be underwhelmed by the emotions, or the clarity of them, or the ferocity of them, precisely in the cases where what's happening has either been so normalized or is systemic or isn't individualized. Like, we also have this difficulty, I think, in in imagining what are the sort of right responses across the spectrum of people who are implicated in these sort of harms that are rooted in these deeper systemic issues. I wonder if that plays somewhat in terms of some of the dynamics of rape culture, for example, or where it can make people so completely angry when they can personalize it, when they can personify it. But we find it so difficult in the absence of that to have, you know, that kind of drive of emotions when we actually can see it at its systemic levels. I wonder if you might have said that in your work.
That's an excellent point, Jennifer. Thank you for that. You know, I talked about rape culture and rape culture discourse, and this particular talk, I was sort of considering it in light of its implications, you know, for carceral feminist policies, the way that it can sometimes lump together different kinds of sexual violence and harm, so as to contribute to the sense that sexual violence and sexual assault is inescapable and imminent and urgent, which then I suggest lends itself to carceral policies. But the term rape culture and the concept is also extremely productive, and I think an accurate descriptor in many ways of these kinds of banal, insidious harms of systemic gender inequality that women in historically marginalized groups experience, because it is sort of a catch-all term that is meant to capture precisely this, right? The pervasiveness of male privilege, of white supremacy, and the way that they bear down on certain groups more than others, and make rape seem banal. That is precisely what rape culture does, is that it is meant to make these kinds of sexual aggressions seem normal, which then is encouraged to make people who experience them or who feel victimized by them, like their feelings are illegitimate, and that they should not be expressed, and that they should not be externalized, right? This is the containment of feminist rage that I was talking about, how it's a sexist and gendered form of emotional labor. So it's a very complicated concept that I have very mixed feelings about, as you can tell, because it's incredibly productive on the one hand. Yet I think rape culture discourse in certain contexts can lend itself, as I said, to carceral state practices on the other hand.
Diane.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks so much for your talk. Very sophisticated thinking that I'm going to have to mull over. But on the rape culture point, I'm on some policy committees working on policy, and the debate about whether to include a reference to rape culture is actually, in the rooms that I'm in, about signaling a political stance, like it's signaling a feminist stance if you use the rape culture word. So you've politicized your policy, which is, you know, the policymakers don't want it to be politicized. So that's kind of the debate about including that word or not in it. So there's, you know, some policies have it, some don't. But I wanted to just share this finding from another piece of research that I did, that I invited students to share a story or an experience that showed that rape culture was alive and well on university campuses. And almost all of the stories I got were either about Dal dentists or the SMU frosh rape chant. They didn't tell stories of, you know, intimate problems in intimate relationships or random sexual harassment. Those were the stories they told, with the Dal dentists and the SMU, which sort of tells us something about what students understand rape culture to be, right? That it's these big, publicly, you know, media frenzied stories. Anyway, I just thought I would add that in there.
Fascinating, and perhaps part of the reason for that could be that there are other more accurate descriptors for those kinds of concrete harms that they experience in the home, right? That they experience sexual assault or sexual harassment, whereas listening to a rape chant, perhaps there isn't rape culture has sort of some descriptive and analytic purchase to describe that experience that I don't know, that they might not need elsewhere. I don't know.
I like that there was a link too, I think, between those two comments, like you're sort of, what's the politicizing of this? Because there's something about both the chant and Dal dentistry that doesn't include the kind of most monstrous acts that one, interestingly, right, that got added to the myth of Dal dentistry, right, in order to make it more outrageous or more than it was, or to justify the strong emotions or the suspicion that turned out to not be factual but didn't matter, right? And so one of the questions I was going to ask you is about this. So there, on the one hand, there's the bad apple theory, like we need to get the bad apples and expel misogyny. On the other, there was an interesting rejection of inconvenient truths, a rejection of facts that wouldn't sustain the kind of anger and emotion, with a move to, it's the principle of the thing. It doesn't actually matter if they really did any of these things. It's the principle of the thing, which I take it as sort of the move to this. We still get to be outraged because of the culture piece when the facts got inconvenient. And I think that was, there's a part of sustaining the momentum of that anger and outrage when the complexity and messiness and maybe more banal nature of some of the actions, like individual actions, wasn't there. So I was struck by that in terms of both of your comments, right, about how do we maintain and retain this, right?
I think, thank you for that, Jennifer. And I think that in some cases, the bad apple theory, the sort of fearful, traumatized, often white victim, one reason why these stories and these sort of frames of reference have such purchase is that they're so simple. Whereas if you really appreciate the complexity of the thing, right, including the inconvenient facts that you described, really looking at the nuances of not only what was said, what the male students did, but the particular social context in which they did it. And if you look at the systemic nature of the problem at Dalhousie, the reports that were published in the wake of the case talk about various systemic issues involving faculty and students and staff that contributed to a climate and culture that needed to be changed. If you really appreciate that complexity, I think it becomes much harder to sustain the bad apples theory and to suggest that punishment is in fact a comprehensive and systematic solution. I mean, it clearly isn't. I think no one acts in isolation. And as relational feminist theorists, we know that everyone acts, in relation to other people, in complex systems. And I think that we really need to think about problems through that lens to then frame policy responses that are equally complex and equally responsive. And the sort of single axis, sort of punitive approach does not do that.
Really helpful. Jean.
Hi, thanks so much, Daniel. Great as always. I'm wondering if you could help me think through or talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about empathy in relation to this. So near the end of your presentation, you sort of talked about empathy as, I'm not getting your words exactly right here, but just sort of one of the central drivers around legal imagination and sort of opening up possibility. And so I'm reading folks talking about empathy who are also a bit more critical about that, right? So thinking that we shouldn't think about empathy as necessarily engaged or like a prerequisite for pro-social behavior, but then are you thinking about empathy in relation to justice differently, or just because I think empathy has become such a buzzword in those spaces. And I'm wondering if you could just talk more about the way empathy intersects with this idea of the legal imagination and building the legal imagination and new solutions, or even about the role of empathy in restorative justice.
Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting question and a tough one. Because as you say, I read some of the literature around empathy and compassion in the law and emotions field. The law and emotion field seems to have focused considerably on certain emotions more than others. And empathy and compassion are two that really get a lot of traction in the field. So I suggest, and I rely heavily on Max Delmar's recent work for this, that people who exercise empathy more sort of broadly and can exercise it toward people with different perspectives than their own are more likely to apprehend their conditions and apprehend the problems that they face. So as law and policymakers, if we can cultivate more empathy and compassion toward, in this context, people who are the most likely targets of campus sexual violence, then our law and policymaking will be at once more accurate and I think more complex, to go back to what I was saying previously, because the experiences of people that belong to intersectional communities, are more complex and richly nuanced and contingent than the sort of paradigm of the white, fearful, traumatized victim. So that's why I talk about the importance of cultivating multi-perspectival legal imagination, right? Just enabling one's capacity to imagine and then empathize with the situation of other people, by reference to their concrete and lived experiences, and then to create policy solutions around that. But it's challenging, for some of the reasons that I intimated, that fostering that kind of capacity is easier said than done. We might be more inclined to empathize with certain people than others. This falls back into the sort of emotional selectivity trap, where we find that certain kinds of figures, Sarah Ahmed talks about this, like white women's stories in particular, might strike us as most empathetic. So then we seek to make policy decisions on the basis of those feelings, when really those feelings are not a comprehensive indicator of equality and justice. So I think that's something that, again, we need to be mindful of, and we need to critically reflect about why we're feeling what we're feeling, to really think about whether the consequences that we're taking in response to our empathy and our compassion are in fact consistent with feminist goals.
Great. So last call, just in case there's anybody who's been thinking and waiting to ask a question, because I did make a commitment to the lab crew that I would make sure that we ended on time, because I made you all start in the middle of what might otherwise reasonably be considered dinner time. So I was trying to find a sweet spot of where I don't eat up your whole evening, but we're all able to be together. So next time we'll tell people it's perfectly okay to bring your supper. And have sort of a supper club talk with us, right, Alexa? You'll be all good if people are there eating. So I've stalled long enough to give any of you a last chance at a question before I thank Daniel. Great. So I'm very grateful, Daniel, for you taking such care and such time to bring us a talk that was provocative and energizing and hard for us to think about and find ourselves in this story, along with you sharing where you were in the story, and then think about its implications for our work. And so as I'm grateful that for all you've brought to the community of fellows and associates, grateful tonight that we were able to share some of that with some of the folks in the wider community connected to the lab and to your work as well.